When you think of the Roman Empire, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, you imagine legionaries in Lorica Segmentata, gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, the classical pagan empire of Augustus and Trajan. Sure, that's part of Roman history, but this classical period only represents a small portion of Roman history. Contrary to popular belief, the Roman Empire survived the fall of its western half in 476. In fact, it continued uninterrupted for another 1,000 years. Taken as a whole, the Roman Empire was Christian much longer than it was pagan. Instead of evoking visions of the Pantheon and Hadrian, the Roman Empire should instead prompt us to imagine the Hagia Sophia and Saint Justinian. Based in the magnificent city of Constantinople, nearly 100 emperors came and went. Sadly, this Byzantine period is less appreciated than the aforementioned classical period. In this series, we will embark on a fascinating journey through Byzantine history, ranking each of the emperors from Constantine I to Constantine XI from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Let's dive in. Welcome back to my series on the Roman emperors. In the last installment, we left off at the deposition of Justinian II in 695. In this video, I'll be covering the emperors of the 20 Years Anarchy and the Isaurian Dynasty. Let's begin with Leontius. As we've seen, Leontius usurped the throne and became emperor in 695. Justinian's nose was cut off, and he was exiled to Kherson. As a general rule, I don't like usurpers, but I will give Leontius credit for being merciful. Instead of executing Justinian, he simply cut off his nose and mutilated his tongue. While it may sound barbaric to modern ears, the practice of mutilation was a merciful alternative to execution. The accession of Leontius in 695 effectively marks the beginning of the 20 Years Anarchy. Over the next 2 decades, 6 emperors would come and go in quick succession. As Anthony Kaldellis points out, anarchy is something of a misnomer here. During the so-called 20 Years Anarchy, state institutions functioned well. There was little social unrest, and the Romans held their own against the Arabs. In fact, they emerged from that era victorious. Instability was limited to the throne. This resilience of the polity, regardless of who sat on the throne, was one of the unique features of the Roman constitution. Contrasting this with medieval Western monarchy, Peter Sarris makes a fascinating observation. The former provinces of the Western Roman Empire had come to be dominated by warlords of primarily barbarian descent, presiding over what were now king-focused societies ruled by an elite, which was essentially martial in outlook and culture. Of course, the Roman Empire had been led by men of war too. But when the Goths had killed the ruling Roman Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, they had not captured or destroyed the empire, which had a bureaucratic and ideological resilience and depth, independent of any one ruler or dynasty. By contrast, the capture of the Vandal king Gelimer, like the death of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, had sealed the fate of his entire realm. None of this is meant as a value judgment, as I think both of these systems have their pros and cons, but clearly they represent 2 different kinds of monarchy. In a future video, I'll explore these ideas in further depth, along with other curious aspects of the Roman imperial system. But for now, suffice it to say, the 20 Years Anarchy wasn't as chaotic as the name implies. Returning to our narrative, in 697 the Arabs captured Carthage. Leontius responded by sending an imperial army to retake the city. This mission was a resounding success. In addition to Carthage, the Romans managed to liberate many of the nearby towns. Unfortunately, however, this victory was a fleeting one. When Arab reinforcements arrived, the city was lost for good, and the Romans were totally driven off. Defeated and demoralized, they sailed back to Constantinople. On the way, while stationed in Crete, the army rebelled and acclaimed a new emperor by the name of Apsamar, who took the name Tiberius III. Then Tiberius and his men sailed to Constantinople. Some of the troops guarding the walls were bribed, and Apsamar managed to enter the city where he overthrew Leontius. Like Justinian, Leontius lost his nose, but instead of exile, he was confined to a monastery in the capital. How should we rank Leontius? Had he reigned longer, perhaps he would have been a good emperor. The only noteworthy thing that happened during his brief reign was the fall of Carthage, but I don't fault him for it, since he made a valiant effort to reverse it, and it was probably inevitable anyways. In my opinion, he was neither good or bad, so I'll put Leontius in the C tier. Tiberius III. Tiberius was another usurper. However, as we've seen, he was quite merciful to his predecessor, Leontius. Overall, he was pretty competent too. While the caliph was distracted with a revolt in Iraq, Tiberius ordered a large imperial army to attack Syria. This force would be led by the emperor's brother, Heraclius. Heraclius was a solid general. Crossing the Taurus Mountains, he defeated an Arab army sent against him and successfully went on to raid as far as Samosata in northern Syria. In the grand scheme of things, this was an insignificant victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Once Abd al-Malik suppressed the revolt, the Arabs returned to raiding Roman territory, especially Roman Armenia. The caliph's son marched to Cilicia and fortified the city of Mopsuestia. This would be used as a military base close to the border, which the Arabs could use as a springboard for future incursions west into Anatolia or north into Armenia. The Romans, led by Heraclius, were consistently victorious over every raiding party sent west. But the Armenians weren't so lucky. By 704, the Caliphate had once again brought Armenia under its sway. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Tiberius was receiving troubling news. Having evaded arrest in Kherson, the exiled and noseless emperor Justinian II had fled to Khazaria and allied with Khagan Busir. When Tiberius was alerted to this, he coordinated with the Khagan, who agreed to assassinate the fugitive. But Justinian wasn't going to go down that easy. Remarkably, he narrowly escaped this attempt on his life, killing the assassins who were sent against him. Fleeing to the Balkans, he entered into an alliance with the Bulgars and led an army toward Constantinople. Anticipating the coming showdown, Tiberius recalled his brother Heraclius from the Eastern Front. In 705, Justinian reached the Theodosian walls, but he was refused entry by the troops who remained loyal to Tiberius. For Justinian, time was of the essence. Heraclius would be there soon. How loyal would his new Bulgar allies be if they had to confront genuine opposition? Justinian needed to find a way into the city quickly. 3 days into the siege, he caught his lucky break. Finding an abandoned subterranean aqueduct, Justinian and a few of his men crawled their way into the city. Once inside, they fomented a coup and successfully deposed Tiberius III. How should we rank Tiberius? He seems to have been a relatively competent emperor, but once again he was a usurper, and once again he didn't do anything particularly great. Therefore, I'll put him in the C tier. Justinian II. Justinian had truly done the impossible. In a remarkable series of events, the mutilated emperor had retaken the throne. In thanks for his help, Justinian bestowed the title of Caesar on Bulgaria's Khan Tervel. As a side note, Tervel converted to Christianity, and the church remembers him as Saint Trevellius. Now sporting a prosthetic golden nose, Justinian immediately set to work punishing his enemies and consolidating his rule. Tiberius and Leontius were humiliated and executed, along with a number of their associates, including Heraclius. Justinian also blinded and exiled Saint Callinicus, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who had sided with Leontius in his first deposition. These reprisals are a mark against Justinian's character, and they fit the narrative that he was a cruel, bloodthirsty man. But most ignore the fact that he spared the son of Tiberius, a surprising act of clemency. Unfortunately, Justinian's second reign was marked by military failure against the Arabs and the Bulgars. In Italy, the emperor intervened in a dispute between Rome and Ravenna. Taking the side of the Pope, Justinian violently punished the leading men of Ravenna and unleashed an army against the city. By this, he managed to get Pope Constantine to give some sort of qualified assent to the Quinisext canons. In 711, there was a disturbance in Kherson, and Justinian sent a fleet there. After a complicated series of events, Justinian's forces defected to the rebels in Kherson, and they proclaimed a new emperor named Philippicus. By this point, Justinian was off on campaign, and Philippicus was able to sail straight for Constantinople, taking the city without a fight. Justinian was tracked down and beheaded. How should we rank Justinian II? This might be controversial, but I'm going to put him in the B tier. When I first learned about Justinian, I fell for the mainstream narrative that he was nothing but a cartoon villain. He's usually portrayed as a mad, capricious psychopath, so I can understand why this view is so widespread. However, after reading a book about him by Constance Head, I'm convinced that this mainstream narrative is mostly slander and fake news. In fact, I recently made a full-length video on the truth about Justinian and his legacy, so be sure to check it out if you want to learn more about this fascinating emperor. In short, from an administrative point of view, he was pretty mediocre. He wasn't great, but he also wasn't a disaster. From a moral point of view, he certainly wasn't a cartoon villain, but he also committed some terrible sins. Nevertheless, and this is usually ignored by mainstream historians, Justinian also displayed a number of impressive virtues. In particular, he was a pious Orthodox Christian. Most of the worst accusations against him are slanderous, and it appears that his legacy has been unfairly tarnished by his successors, in particular, Leo III. The idea that he was simply obsessed with revenge is a false caricature. Regarding his status in the church, this is a matter of controversy. Justinian II appears on some lists of saints, but not on many. At the end of the day, he might be a saint, but I don't have enough evidence to conclude that he's a canonized saint. In my opinion, Justinian II was an extremely complex individual. I'm deeply conflicted about him, but all things considered, I have a soft spot for the noseless emperor. Justinian II definitely isn't my favorite emperor, but overall, I have a positive assessment of him. Philippicus. After taking power in 711, Philippicus tried to repeal the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Apparently, the new emperor was a monothelite heretic, and he had the wild idea to revive a heresy that had been dead for 30 years. For his refusal to go along with the emperor's will, Saint Sarris, the Orthodox patriarch who had been appointed by Justinian, was deposed and replaced by a like-minded heretic. His goals aside, the method was somewhat unconventional. Instead of calling a robber synod to affirm monothelitism, Philippicus tried to repeal the Ecumenical Council in a meeting of the Senate and the top clergy. Meanwhile, Saint Truvelius, the Bulgarian Khan, raided Roman Thrace. This was probably in retaliation for the usurpation and execution of his friend and patron, Justinian II. To respond to this threat, Philippicus transported some troops from Anatolia to the Balkans. Specifically, these Roman troops came from the Opsikian theme of northwest Anatolia. I haven't mentioned it thus far, but gradually during the course of the Heraclean dynasty, the Roman Empire was organized into a system of themes. These themes were local districts in which civil and military authority were concentrated for the purpose of rapid defense. The troops of each theme would be drawn from those who lived there and usually stationed locally. This system worked well for centuries to come. Anyways, when Philippicus transported the Opsikian troops to Thrace, this weakened the empire's defenses and allowed the Arabs to make further inroads in the east. At the same time, the Bulgars were prevailing over the Romans in Thrace. In light of the empire's deteriorating military situation, many thought it was time to get rid of the emperor. Foremost among them was a man named George Baraphos, a commander of the Opsikian troops who were stationed in Thrace. In 713, George sent some men to infiltrate the palace. Finding Philippicus asleep and alone, they blinded him. The next morning was Pentecost, and nobody knew where the emperor was. If George and his Opsikian conspirators were hoping to take the throne, they foolishly neglected to secure the palace. Once everyone realized what had happened to Philippicus, it was decided that a new emperor was needed. Of course, a blind man could not lead the empire. Gathered in the Hagia Sophia, the Senate, the clergy, the soldiers, and the people elevated Artemius, a secretary of the former emperor. He took the name Anastasius II. What's my verdict on Philippicus? I think he was an incompetent usurper. Worse, he was a monothelite heretic who tried, in vain, to reverse the Sixth Council. In short, he totally lacked any redeemable qualities. As far as I'm concerned, even if he was Orthodox, he would still be a below-average emperor, but given that he was a heretic, I have no choice but to put him firmly in the F tier. Philippicus is very reminiscent of Basiliscus, the incompetent Monophysite heretic who usurped Zeno, who I also put in the F tier. Anastasius II. Anastasius II was a significant improvement compared to his predecessor. One of his first moves was to punish the conspirators who had blinded Philippicus. George and his comrades were blinded and exiled. This angered the Opsikian troops, and it would eventually be his undoing. Anyways, as a good Orthodox Christian, Anastasius wasted no time in reversing the heretical policy of Philippicus and reinstating the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Anastasius then sent a diplomat to the Caliph, ostensibly for the purpose of negotiating a peace, but he knew no peace would be forthcoming. The true purpose of this diplomatic mission was to spy on the Arabs, for the emperor suspected they were preparing a massive siege of Constantinople. When the diplomats returned, they confirmed the emperor's worst fears. A major attack was coming, and it was coming soon. Anastasius began to make preparations for the empire's defense. He reinforced the fortifications of Constantinople, commanded the building of many ships, and stored away great quantities of supplies and food to weather the impending siege. He also issued an ominous public service announcement to the people of Constantinople. If you can't store food for 3 years, you need to leave the capital. In 715, he was made aware that a large Arab fleet was stationed off the southern coast of Anatolia, cutting down trees to build more ships in preparation for the siege. In response, Anastasius sent a Roman fleet to attack the Muslims. Perhaps this surprise attack could send the Arabs into disorder and temporarily delay the inevitable. The Roman fleet assembled at Rhodes under the command of a man named John, who also just so happened to be a deacon in the Church of Hagia Sophia. Crucially, some of John's troops included men of the ever-rebellious Opsikian theme. Before they could confront the Arab fleet, a disturbance broke out among the Romans. The Opsikian troops cursed the emperor and refused to follow John's orders. Then they proceeded to murder poor Deacon John. The rest of the men dispersed, not wanting to associate themselves with this shameful mutiny. Then the rebellious Opsikian troops moved against Constantinople. On the way, they found a man named Theodosius, a tax collector, an ordinary man with no interest in politics, whom they urged to assume the purple. He ran away and hid on a mountain, but they pursued him, proclaimed him emperor under pressure, and took him along. Hearing of this, Anastasius fled to Nicaea and entrusted the capital to his loyal officers. Upon reaching Constantinople, the rebellious Opsikian troops battled with the loyalists for about 6 months. Eventually, the rebels managed to bribe one of the guards on the land walls, enter the city, and install Theodosius. Seeing the writing on the wall, Anastasius agreed to abdicate. He was exiled, unharmed, to a monastery in Thessalonica. How do I rank Anastasius? Overall, I think he was a solid emperor. He was very competent, and he took several wise measures to prepare for the upcoming siege. Unfortunately, he didn't reign longer, but in the time he had, I think he did his job to the best of his ability. Most importantly, he was an Orthodox Christian, and he reversed the bizarre, heretical policy of his predecessor. Therefore, I think Anastasius more than deserves the B tier. Theodosius III. We've seen that Theodosius was a reluctant emperor. He never wanted the crown, but it was forced on him by the rebellious army, likely because they thought he would be easy to control. In 715, an Arab general named Maslama invaded Anatolia, headed straight for Constantinople with a massive army. This was the dreaded invasion force that would initiate the siege. Ahead of Maslama was sent a smaller invasion force, led by a general called Suleiman. He made straight for Amorion and put the city under siege. Amorion was the capital of the Anatolic theme, and the strategos of that theme was none other than Leo. If you recall from my video on Justinian II, Leo was a clever and ambitious young man who first rose to prominence during Justinian's second reign. But it would seem that he was appointed to strategos of the Anatolikon by Anastasius. He was apparently a supporter of Anastasius, so he was displeased when Theodosius usurped the throne. Suleiman was aware of Leo's discontent, and he tried to use this to sow division among the Romans. Having surrounded the city, the Arabs proclaimed Leo as emperor. Presumably, the Arabs wanted to co-opt Leo into their invasion force and install him as a puppet king in Constantinople. But Leo wouldn't play ball, and he was far more clever than the enemy general. In a complex series of negotiations, Leo repeatedly tricked the Arabs. By this, he managed to delay their approach to the capital. Eventually, he slipped away to Nicomedia with some of his friends. There, they found the son of Theodosius and captured him. Entering into negotiations with the emperor, Leo promised to release his son if he would simply abdicate the throne. Promised with immunity, Theodosius gladly handed imperial power to Leo. He and his son entered the priesthood and lived the rest of their lives in peace. How should we rank Theodosius III? We don't know much about his short reign. He was Orthodox, and overall it seems like he was a really nice guy. Usually, I admire men who are reluctant to assume power. They often turn out to be good rulers. Unfortunately, Theodosius was forced into the purple at a time of existential crisis for the Romans. I don't think he was totally incompetent, but he clearly wasn't the right man for the job. This might be a bit too harsh, but for that reason, I'll put Theodosius in the D tier. As a side note, the abdication of Theodosius marks the end of the 20 Years Anarchy. For now, Leo was just another usurper, but as it turns out, he would have a long and successful reign, initiating a new dynasty of his own. Leo III. When Leo assumed power, he was immediately confronted by the siege. This was a serious attempt to end the Roman Empire. I won't go into great depth on the details of this epic showdown, but suffice it to say, Leo did a brilliant job. He allied with the Bulgars under St. Tervel, who harassed the Muslim army on land. Furthermore, the Romans drew a heavy chain across the Golden Horn, the first historic reference to that device, and used Greek fire to inflict heavy damage on the enemy fleet. Even God seemed to be on Leo's side, since the winter of 717 to 718 was especially harsh. The Arabs just couldn't catch a break. Hilariously, as they were starving and freezing outside the walls of Constantinople, Leo tricked Maslama into burning the remainder of his supplies. Eventually, the Muslims realized the futility of their situation, and the siege was called off in 718. But the suffering wasn't done yet. Many perished in fierce storms on their way back. As St. Theophanes triumphantly declared in his chronicle, many other calamities befell the Arabs at that time and made them learn by experience that God and the all-holy Virgin, the Mother of God, protect this city and the Christian Empire, and that those who call upon God in truth are not entirely forsaken, even if we are chastised for a short time on account of our sins. Leo and St. Tervel deserve great credit for defeating the Muslims in this siege. By holding the line at the Bosphorus, they saved all of Christendom from the Islamic hordes. At the same time that Constantinople was under siege, the armies of Islam were gobbling up Spain on the other side of the Mediterranean. But 15 years later, the caliphate would be halted by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. I have a ton of respect for Charles Martel, and I have no desire to minimize his accomplishment. However, these two great Christian victories were not equivalent. At the Siege of Constantinople, Leo and Tervel defeated a massive invasion force, saved the Roman Empire, and crippled the Caliphate. By contrast, Martel defeated a raiding party, and the long-term impact of his victory is debatable. I still think he deserves enormous amounts of credit, but it's disappointing that few speak similarly of Leo III or St. Tervel. In the popular imagination, those aforementioned heroes get far less acknowledgement. This was the last Arab siege of Constantinople, and the city would continue to stand as a Christian bulwark amidst the heathen storm for another 7 centuries. Following his victory over the Arabs, Leo faced a couple of wannabe usurpers. One of these was Anastasius II. Leaving his monastery in Thessalonica, he entered into an alliance with the Bulgars and marched on Constantinople to make a bid for the throne. But after he was refused entry, the Bulgars betrayed him to Leo and he was beheaded, along with his closest associates. Turning our attention to religious matters, Leo made an effort to convert the empire's Jews and Montanists, but apparently this failed. In his relations with the papacy, Leo was highly antagonistic. The details aren't exactly clear, but it seems like the emperor imposed some onerous taxes on papal lands. Pope St. Gregory II responded by refusing to pay these taxes. Leo retaliated by confiscating the lands in question, which was a major blow to papal finances. But these heavy-handed policies were only one factor in the emperor's poor relationship with Rome. Once again, the details are murky, but sometime around 730, Leo initiated the heresy of iconoclasm. Historians and scholars debate over why he did this, but it's very possible that it was of Islamic influence. The emperor may have believed that the icons were arousing God's wrath, causing the Roman Empire to decline at the expense of the Muslims, who rejected images and accused the Christians of idolatry. It also isn't clear to what extent Leo III persecuted the iconodules and their sacred images. In all likelihood, his persecution was somewhat moderate. In any case, he was a heretic, and he set a terrible precedent for his successors, who would wage war against the icons with even more ferocity. Leo's tax policies had already alienated the papacy, but his iconoclasm only made the situation worse, because Rome, to her credit, held fast to the holy icons. To make matters worse, imperial power was slowly receding from the Italian peninsula. In 739, the Lombards briefly captured Ravenna. Although it was quickly retaken by imperial forces, this was a sign of things to come. By the middle of the century, the Byzantines would lose nearly all of their territory in north and central Italy. These military developments, combined with Leo's harsh taxation and his heresy, forced Rome to seek protection elsewhere and assert more independence. This reorientation would have tremendous implications for world history, but we'll talk about that later. Let's turn our attention to the Eastern Front. The Arabs had been chastised in 718. The failed siege was a major blow to the finances and the prestige of the caliphate, and it represented a high watermark for the Arabs, but they hadn't given up. Not long after the failed siege, the caliphate resumed its annual raids into Asia Minor. In general, these weren't aimed at permanent conquest. Instead, these raids consisted of large-scale plundering and devastation of the countryside. Occasionally, however, they still managed to penetrate deep into Asia Minor, like in 727, when Nicaea was placed under a brutal 40-day siege. St. Theophanes reports that during this siege, an iconoclast soldier threw a rock at and trampled upon an icon of the Mother of God. Then the Queen of Heaven herself appeared to him, warning him of his imminent fate. The next day, after battle commenced, this soldier's head was smashed by a massive rock hurled by an Arab catapult. At the end of the day, the city was spared. Both sides of the iconoclast dispute claimed this victory as evidence that their side was in the right. But I side with Theophanes, who attributes the salvation of Nicaea to the prayers of the fathers of the Council of Nicaea, whose icons adorned the church there. Despite this small victory, the Muslims clearly retained the upper hand in the conflict. In 740, the Arabs launched an unusually large expedition against the Romans, consisting of 3 separate armies. 2 of those armies accomplished little and returned home. But in 740, Leo defeated the 3rd army at the Battle of Akroinon. It was a crushing victory, the first major win that the Romans had scored against the Saracens in decades, and it boosted morale. For Leo, perhaps, it confirmed to him that God approved of his iconoclastic policies. The Umayyad Caliphate would soon dissolve and be replaced by the Abbasids. Just before his death, Leo issued the Eclogue, an abridged version of the laws from Justinian's corpus with some minor revisions. It was a clarified, streamlined selection from the corpus, not an attempt to replace it. Where it did make innovations, these were done for the purpose of reforming the law to make it even more harmonious with Christian values. Overall, it was quite good. Leo explicitly states his intentions were to promote his subjects' salvation. The Eclogue would later be abandoned by the Macedonian dynasty, likely because of its association with the hated Isaurian dynasty. Leo III died in 741, and he was succeeded by his son Constantine V. How should we rank Leo? He was a competent and successful administrator. If we were to ignore his religious policies, he would rank quite well. The problem is he was an iconoclast heretic. To make matters worse, Leo initiated the heresy of iconoclasm. We've seen that many Roman emperors had fallen into heresy. Constantius II was an Arian, Anastasius I was a Monophysite, and Constans II was a Monothelite. But thus far, no emperor was himself a heresiarch. In other words, all the heretical emperors adopted existing heresies. They didn't invent them. The only possible exception may be Heraclius, who championed monoenergism and monothelitism. But the truth is that Patriarch Sergius was probably the primary origin for those heresies. So Leo III essentially stands alone with the infamy of creating his own heresy. As far as I'm concerned, there's a huge difference between being a heretic and being a heresiarch. Of course, both are bad, but there's a special place in hell for people who invent heresies, for those who not only accept heresy, but who lead vulnerable souls to perdition. Of all the theological battles that racked the Roman Empire, few would be so bitter or so enduring, with so many negative consequences as iconoclasm. It was a disease that afflicted the Romans for the rest of the 8th century. Worse, it was a zombie heresy. Even after iconoclasm was killed at the 7th Ecumenical Council in 787, it refused to die. It once again reared its ugly head in the 9th century. Although the iconoclast controversy would eventually be settled, and the Orthodox would prevail in the end, this whole episode created lasting damage to the political relationship between Rome and Constantinople. Since the days of Justinian, Rome had been an integral part of the Byzantine Empire, and the popes were elected on the approval of the emperor. To be sure, this wasn't always an idyllic relationship. Sometimes the imperial government could be heavy-handed. Sometimes the pope came into conflict with the emperor, especially when the latter fell into heresy. Nevertheless, all things considered, despite these occasional tensions, Rome got along quite well with Constantinople, and many of the popes were of Eastern extraction. This period was characterized by great saintly popes, foremost among them Saint Pope Gregory the Great. From an Orthodox perspective, this can be seen as something of a papal golden age. Vladimir Moss concurs. Here's how he describes the period. For centuries, the Roman papacy had seen itself as part of the Eastern Empire and a vital link with the other 4 patriarchates of the East. Several of the popes were Greek or Syrian in origin. The popes still looked to New Rome as the capital of the Christian oikomene. They still commemorated the Eastern emperors at the liturgy and still used the emperor's coinage. East and West still constituted one Christian world. However, as Byzantine power withered away on the Italian peninsula, the popes began to seek protection elsewhere. As we've seen, this political realignment was exacerbated by iconoclasm. The papacy boldly resisted, rightly viewing this as the latest in a string of imperial heresies. Constantinople was increasingly seen as an unreliable guardian, both from a political and a theological point of view. Over the course of the 8th century, the papacy began to ally itself more closely to the Franks. This was the transition from the Byzantine papacy to the Frankish papacy. Under Frankish influence, Rome would slowly drift further away from Constantinople. For now, the papacy was still Orthodox, but it wouldn't last for long. Rome's political realignment preceded and was integral to its later theological realignment. This is also the period in which certain papal forgeries, like the donation of Constantine, were invented. I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but in my view, this was the beginning of the end for the papacy. The Great Schism of 1054 was still 3 centuries away, but the seeds were already being sown in earnest. As Craig Truglia says, it is during the 8th century that Rome finally realizes its own independence. It is this political independence, though not immediately leading to theological changes, that is the real impetus behind the papacy's final fall. Much of the blame for this can be pinned directly on Leo and his successors. While Leo deserves great credit for his other accomplishments, these are far outweighed by his terrible religious policies. As much as I want to like Leo, I have no choice but to place him in the E tier. The only reason I won't put him in the F tier is because he pursued iconoclasm with more moderation than his son, and because he saved Constantinople during the siege. Constantine V Copronymus. Constantine V was born during the siege of Constantinople. When the boy was being baptized, he famously defecated in the font, a bad omen for his future. Thus, he earned the name Copronymus, which means the dung-named. Leo reigned for a full 24 years, so Constantine grew up in his father's shadow. As a young man, he joined his father on campaign and learned how to be an emperor. After the death of Leo in 741, Constantine inherited the throne. However, the succession was quickly contested by an ambitious rival. Artabasdos had been a close ally of the regime. Back in 717, he had helped Leo secure the throne. As a reward, Artabasdos was promoted to strategos of the Opsikian theme and married to the emperor's daughter. Thus, Artabasdos was an experienced military commander with a long record of loyal service, the son-in-law of Leo and the brother-in-law of Constantine. It seems that he wasn't content with the idea of taking a back seat to the sovereign, so after Leo died, Artabasdos began making plans to usurp the throne. But at first, he feigned loyalty to Constantine. During a joint military expedition against the Arabs, Artabasdos and his men ambushed the young emperor, who barely escaped with his life. The rebel even managed to secure Constantinople, where he was acclaimed and crowned as emperor. However, Constantine wasn't going to go down that easy. He retreated to Amorion, the capital of the Anatolikon, where the troops were loyal to him. A bitter civil war ensued, which lasted for about 2 years. In the end, Constantine successfully defeated his brother-in-law and kept his throne. In doing so, he demonstrated his extraordinary military talent and his leadership. In the late 740s, the bubonic plague once again swept through the empire, so Constantine briefly moved his court to Nicomedia. Since its height during the reign of Justinian, Constantinople's population had been significantly reduced. In the mid-6th century, the capital boasted about 500,000 people. Following the Islamic conquests, the empire lost the breadbasket provinces of Egypt and North Africa. As a result, the Romans simply couldn't feed such a massive city, so the population declined. Not to mention, repeated bouts of plague had decimated the population. It was still a major metropolis, but now large swaths of the city were devoted to farmland. Constantine sought to reverse this by transplanting many families from Greece and the Aegean Islands to replenish the capital. Then he embarked on a grand program of urban renewal. He rebuilt churches and parts of the Theodosian walls that had been damaged by earthquakes. Constantine also repaired Valens Aqueduct, which had long been in a state of disuse. In the 740s, raids into Asia Minor became more rare. This was due to the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate, which I alluded to earlier. The Umayyads would fall in 750, and they would be replaced by the Abbasids. But in the meantime, the Muslims were distracted with their own problems, so the eastern frontier was relatively calm. Taking advantage of this, Constantine led multiple raids into the Caliphate. Victorious, the emperor resettled thousands of Christians in Thrace. These population transfers reinforced the Roman position in the Balkans, but it was a serious threat to the Bulgars. In about 756, the Bulgars broke the peace and raided Thrace. Constantine responded by launching about 10 campaigns to the north. He was mostly victorious, and he even celebrated 2 triumphs. He also made some important reforms to the military. In particular, he tinkered with the theme system to diminish the power of the Opsikian theme, and he created a new unit called the Tagmata that would stay in Constantinople and remain fiercely loyal to the emperor. In religious affairs, Constantine was, like his father, an iconoclast heretic. In fact, he pursued iconoclasm more aggressively than Leo had. In 754, he called a robber council to condemn icons. This was the Council of Hieria. As a side note, this false council was chaired by Theodosius Apsamar, the son of Emperor Tiberius Apsamar, who Justinian had spared after retaking the throne. It's fascinating to wonder how church history might have been different had Justinian II eliminated the young prince Theodosius, or better yet, if he had eliminated Leo. If Justinian was even half as ruthless as his detractors make him out to be, maybe the iconoclast controversy would have never happened. In any case, Constantine called the Council of Hieria with the intention that it would go down in history as the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Thankfully, the church eventually rejected it as heretical, but at the time, things must have looked pretty bleak for the iconodules. Although Constantine was militarily successful in the east and against the Bulgars, he basically neglected the west. It was during his reign that the imperial position in north and central Italy finally collapsed. In 751, Ravenna fell to the Lombards, and no troops were sent to restore imperial control. Pope St. Zachary died in 752, conventionally marking the end of the Byzantine papacy. As I mentioned earlier, from here on out, the popes would turn to the Franks as their new temporal guardians. In 754, Stephen II traveled to Paris, where he met with Frankish King Pepin the Short. There, the Pope crowned Pepin and invited him to intervene in Italy against the Lombards. Pepin was the father of Charlemagne, and he was in the Pope's debt, since he had recently ascended to the throne by overthrowing the last Merovingian king Childeric III with papal support. The Franks descended into Italy twice, forcing the Lombards out of Ravenna and the Pentapolis. In 756, Pepin donated a large swath of Italian land to the Pope, thus creating the Papal States, an unprecedented expansion of the temporal power of the papacy. Henceforth, the Byzantines would mostly be relegated to southern Italy, and the papacy would be colonized by the Franks. As I've argued, this was a major shift, which eventually culminated in the Great Schism. After a long reign, Constantine V died in 775, succeeded by his son Leo IV. How should we rank Constantine? Many secular historians and armchair historians rank him as one of the best Roman emperors. This is usually because of his great achievements on the battlefield. I think Constantine deserves credit for these accomplishments, but we should remember that he was only able to do all this because the caliphate was collapsing. In other words, he may have been a good general, but he was also incredibly lucky to reign when he did. We've also seen that Constantine did great work in revitalizing the city of Constantinople. I know this is going to be controversial, but because he pursued iconoclasm with such an intense fervor, I have to rank him in the F tier. For me, being a good Orthodox Christian is far more important than being a good general. Like his father before him, Constantine was an otherwise successful and competent emperor, but his legacy is forever tainted by heresy. Leo IV the Khazar. Leo IV was the first son of Constantine V by his first wife, a Khazar woman named Zitzak. Thus, Leo was known as the Khazar. In 769, he was married to Irene, a beautiful young woman from Athens who was secretly an iconodule. Irene and Leo quickly gave birth to a son, also named Constantine, in January of 771. After his father's death in 775, Leo IV became emperor. The problem is, Leo had several half-brothers, sons of Constantine and his third wife Eudokia. These included Nikephoros and Christopher, who both held the rank of Caesar. Thus, there were two rival branches of the Isaurian Dynasty. Naturally, these brothers were seen as potential rivals to the succession of Leo's young son. To solve this, Leo paid off the key players among the people, the senators, and the soldiers of the capital. Then, in 776, he crowned his son and asked everyone to swear an oath to accept Constantine as emperor if he should die. A month later, Nikephoros and Christopher were implicated in a plot to overthrow their brother. They were whipped, but otherwise unharmed. Leo's reign was short and mostly uneventful. Like his father, he was an iconoclast, but he doesn't seem to have strongly persecuted the Orthodox. The empire was raided a few times, but he held his own. Leo died only 5 years into his reign. He was succeeded by his son Constantine VI, who was only 9 years old, with Irene as the boy's regent. What's my assessment of Leo? He didn't do anything noteworthy or impressive, and he was a heretic. But in fairness, he was only following in the tradition of his father and his grandfather. I can't rank him higher than a C, but I don't think he deserves anything lower than a D, so I'll put him in the D tier. Constantine VI. As mentioned, Constantine VI came to the throne as a boy, after his father died in 780. Being too young to reign in his own right, his regent was his mother, Irene of Athens. About 1 month into the regency, a conspiracy was uncovered, including several high-ranking officials, including Constantine's uncles Nikephoros and Christopher. As punishment, Irene forced them into the priesthood. In a show of power, these disgruntled priests were forced to publicly commune Constantine and Irene on nativity in the Church of Hagia Sophia. Since Irene was a woman, she couldn't lead an army on the battlefield. This was a problem because military leadership was seen as integral to an emperor's legitimacy. Therefore, she regarded the generals with suspicion. Instead of working closely with the generals who could easily usurp her, she relied heavily on palace eunuchs. Irene allied with these eunuchs and appointed them to important positions, including military ones. These eunuchs couldn't claim the throne, and they lacked family ties. Also, since they were impotent, she could meet with them privately without scandal. However, this was highly controversial, especially with the theme armies, who began to resent Irene. These soldiers saw the best jobs going to eunuchs, thus curtailing their opportunities for promotion. In foreign relations, Irene sought to build a friendship with Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom. By this point, he had swept up whatever remained of the kingdom of the Lombards in northern Italy. Irene sent envoys to Aachen, proposing a match between his daughter Rotrud and her son Constantine VI. For unknown reasons, this match never materialized. Meanwhile, in 782, Anatolia was invaded by the Abbasids under Harun al-Rashid. The Muslims reached as far as Chrysopolis, just across from Constantinople. The Roman forces, led by Irene's chief eunuch named Staurakios, managed to surround them. The Arabs sued for peace and opened negotiations for surrender, but Staurakios went to the meeting without taking proper precautions, and he was captured. Following this, Irene was forced to pay a massive amount of tribute in order to ransom the prisoners and get the Arabs to depart. Despite this humiliation, the Romans had some military success in this period. For the last century or more, the imperial government only had a tenuous grasp over Greece. Beyond the isolated imperial outposts, large swaths of this region had been dominated by the Slavs. But in 783, Staurakios invaded the Peloponnese, where he successfully reasserted Roman authority. In 784, Irene and Constantine paraded through Thrace with a small force. This was largely symbolic, but the message was clear. The Romans were back, and they intended to restore imperial control over the Balkans. By the middle of the decade, Irene was prepared to deal with the Church. As an Orthodox empress, she totally rejected the heresy of iconoclasm. However, the army was fiercely iconoclastic, owing to the memory of Leo III and especially Constantine V. To many members of the military, especially the men of the Tagmata, the victorious legacy of the iconoclast emperors was proof that God was on their side. Thus, Irene would face serious opposition if she wished to reverse iconoclasm. In 784, she appointed a layman, Saint Tarasios, as Patriarch of Constantinople. Then she called a council that met at the Church of the Holy Apostles on August 1st, 786. The meeting had only just started when about 10 bishops and several soldiers violently interrupted the proceedings. The ecumenical council would have to be postponed. But Irene was clever, and she wouldn't take this setback lying down. On the pretext of an Arab invasion, she sent the iconoclastic Tagmata to Anatolia and replaced them with troops loyal to her. In 787, she called another council, this time in Nicaea. This was the Second Council of Nicaea, the Seventh Ecumenical Council. This council reversed the heretical robber council of Constantine V and ended the first phase of iconoclasm. Just as Constantinople was returning to orthodoxy, Aachen was beginning to flirt with heresy. No Frankish clergy had been invited to the Council of Nicaea, and this was seen as a slap in the face. More than that, the Franks were beginning to see themselves as the only legitimate Christian empire. Why should the emperor of the Greeks have the privilege to call an ecumenical council that was binding on the whole church? In 794, Charlemagne called a rival council in Frankfurt, which affirmed a moderate form of iconoclasm and the Filioque addition to the Nicene Creed. Regarding icons, they declared that it was impermissible to break them, and it was okay to have them for teaching purposes, but it was idolatrous to venerate them. It should be noted that the Frankish bishops were working with a poor Latin translation of the Acts of the Seventh Council. Therefore, the semi-iconoclastic conclusions of Frankfurt might be due to an overreaction based on an honest misunderstanding. While not rejecting this explanation completely, Vladimir Moss suggests that there were also political motivations at work. As he puts it, it's highly likely that Charlemagne was actually looking for an excuse to reject the Eastern Empire as idol-worshipping and heterodox, and put himself forward as the one true and Orthodox Christian emperor. Unlike the Second Council of Nicaea, this Council of Frankfurt was never accepted by the Church, East or West. For now, the popes of Rome were still Orthodox. They resisted both Frankish semi-iconoclasm and the Filioque. But unfortunately, this papal resistance didn't last forever. According to Vladimir Moss, Roman Catholicism began when the popes, instead of resisting the heresies of Charlemagne, adopted those heresies themselves, and then proclaimed themselves to be emperors as well as priests. The Great Schism of 1054 is still centuries away, but already in the late 8th century, we can see the first seeds of theological development led by Charlemagne and his court theologians. As Father John Strickland explains, Charlemagne exhibited a driving ambition to form a Western Christendom distinct from the Byzantine East. Now let's return to the East. After the Seventh Ecumenical Council, things were looking pretty good for Irene. Thus far, she had been quite successful. But immediately after the council, the empire suffered simultaneous defeats in Asia Minor, Thrace, and southern Italy. This severely damaged her legitimacy. To make matters worse, her son Constantine was now 17 years old. He was old enough to rule alone, but as it was, he had zero authority. It seems that Irene wanted to rule alone, and she had no intention to relinquish power. Over the course of the next 10 years, tensions would grow between Irene and her son until they reached a tragic breaking point. In 790, Constantine made his move. Though he was ostensibly the emperor, nobody treated him like an emperor. Apparently, he believed that Staurakios was the real sovereign. In Constantine's eyes, the only way to claim his rightful place was to eliminate this powerful eunuch. He became determined to arrest and exile Staurakios, but somehow Staurakios caught wind of the plot and warned Irene. As punishment, she arrested Constantine and his supporters. They were flogged, and Constantine was put under house arrest. This failed power grab reveals that Constantine was profoundly naive. There's no question that Staurakios was powerful, but at the end of the day, he wasn't the one in charge. The truth is that Irene had always been the real de facto sovereign, and now that was clear as day. Having publicly humiliated her son, Irene then demanded that the armies swear loyalty to her as opposed to him. To many, Irene's behavior and the oath of loyalty felt like a massive overreach. Most of the troops submitted to the oath, but the men of the Armenia Khan refused to swear their loyalty to the empress. Emboldened by this refusal, some of the other theme armies joined in the mutiny. Faced with a potential rebellion, Irene was forced to stand down, and Constantine was released from house arrest. He rode out to Etroa, where he was acclaimed as sole emperor. Constantine returned to the capital, and the tables were turned. Now Irene's supporters were flogged and exiled, and Irene was confined to house arrest. Despite this, Constantine seems to have treated her well. Irene's face even remained on imperial coinage. He seems to have genuinely loved her. She was his mother, after all. Only 1 year later, she was restored to her rank as empress. It's unclear what happened, but it seems like Constantine forgave her. He even brought back her supporters, including Staurakios. As we'll see, this was a naive decision. Constantine's supporters saw Irene and her entourage of eunuchs as a threat. But now Irene was back in the proximity of power. We have the benefit of hindsight, but to Constantine, he probably thought there was nothing to be concerned about. He had finally asserted his authority. Now holding the reins of power, Constantine campaigned against the Bulgars and Arabs, but he wasn't able to secure any victories. In 792, Constantine went on campaign in the Balkans, where he was defeated by the Bulgars at the Battle of Markelai. The Romans were utterly defeated, and Constantine barely escaped with his life. Naturally, this defeat damaged the emperor's legitimacy. Some in the military began to conspire to replace Constantine with one of his ever-rebellious uncles. Like the other two plots, this third one was a failure. The power-hungry priest Nikephoros was blinded, and the rest of Constantine's uncles lost their tongues. Now Irene and Staurakios conspired against Alexios Mosel, the strategos of the Armeniakon. Earlier, he had refused to swear the oath of loyalty to Irene, siding instead with Constantine. This had precipitated the end of the regency and Irene's fall from power. Irene and Staurakios told Constantine that Alexios could not be trusted and persuaded the emperor to act against him. The emperor followed this advice and blinded Alexios. Understandably, this was seen as a betrayal to the Armeniakon troops, who, upon hearing of this, broke out in rebellion. In 793, Constantine marched east and suppressed the mutiny. As punishment, he took 1,000 of these soldiers to Constantinople, where they received face tattoos with the words Armeniakos Rebel. Then they were dispersed among the islands. Moves like this were incredibly short-sighted. Recall that Constantine's supporters were members of the military, in particular the troops of the Armeniakon theme, who had supported him over his mother. Therefore, this was seen as a betrayal, and it only succeeded in alienating Constantine's allies. But Constantine wasn't done damaging his popularity yet. The emperor's wife was Maria of Amnia. The imperial couple had been married for 6 years, but sometime around 794, Constantine began to consort with a mistress by the name of Theodote. It's unclear why their relationship broke down, but it might have had something to do with the fact that Maria had only produced 2 daughters. The other possibility is that he never really loved her. Perhaps the match had been Irene's choice, and he had little to say in the marriage. In any case, in 795, Constantine divorced Maria and sent her and both of their daughters to a convent. This was deeply unpopular, especially with the church. Patriarch St. Tarasios refused to bless the union, but he didn't publicly speak out against it either. A certain priest named Joseph officiated the wedding instead. As it turns out, Theodote came from a prominent and influential family. This included 2 holy monks who did not approve of the marriage whatsoever. Her uncle was the abbot, St. Plato the Studite, and her cousin was a monk named St. Theodore the Studite. These 2 were scandalized, and they loudly protested the marriage. Since they felt that Patriarch Tarasios was complicit, they broke communion with him. They also broke communion with Constantine. For this, the emperor locked Plato in prison and exiled Theodore. Constantine was not doing a great job, and he was increasingly hated by everyone. Having alienated all his allies in the army and the church, who would have his back now? By 797, Irene was ready to take another shot at sole rule. At this time, the emperor was staying at a port town on the Sea of Marmara. Meanwhile, Irene had secretly managed to subvert the soldiers in his retinue. One day, he was arrested and brought back to the palace. Once there, Constantine was cruelly blinded by Irene's men. Soon after this, he died from his wounds. This act is one of the darkest in Roman history. According to Theophanes, after this filicide, the sun went dim for 17 days. We've seen that emperors sometimes killed their rivals, real or imagined. This was ugly, but occasionally it was necessary for self-preservation. Sometimes emperors even killed their relatives, but rarely did they kill their own children. We know that St. Constantine ordered the execution of his wife and his son, but there's no evidence that this was a cold-hearted power grab. Rather, he likely did this because he believed they were having an illicit affair. This is a terrible sin, but it's more understandable. Afterwards, having learned the truth, St. Constantine exhibited great repentance. In the case of Irene and her son, it's harder to understand her motives. Constantine VI had proven himself to be a bad emperor, but he wasn't a total disaster. In my opinion, the best explanation is that she eliminated him out of her pure lust for power. In any case, Constantine was dead, and Irene was now the sole, undisputed emperor. How should we evaluate Constantine VI? Overall, it seems like he was rather naive and incompetent. When he finally took power for himself, he made a number of mistakes. He wasn't a good general. Worse, he foolishly betrayed his allies while trusting the very people who would go on to engineer his downfall. In fairness, it seems like he received power all at once as a young man. In addition to the usual burdens of being an emperor, he frequently had to contend with his mother. Had he been handed power bit by bit, this may have been more conducive to his development. Had he reigned longer, perhaps he would have matured and improved. All things considered, I think he was faced with a challenging set of circumstances, so I have some sympathy for him. To his credit, Constantine wasn't an iconoclast, and that's good. Although the Seventh Ecumenical Council took place during his reign, this took place during the regency, so Irene deserves the credit for that. Constantine had a chaotic love life, to put it gently. He was unfaithful to his wife, and then he cruelly dismissed her to marry another woman. This scandalized everyone and even divided the church for a short time. When he was confronted by Saints Plato and Theodore, he responded in the worst possible way, by persecuting them. The way he fell from power was truly disturbing and tragic, but I think he was a bad emperor, and it seems that he was very unpopular. It was probably for the best that he lost the throne. I'll give him a D ranking. He was certainly bad, but he didn't do anything catastrophic, so the long-term damage of his reign was minimal. Irene of Athens. Roman history is filled with powerful women, but until Irene there had never been a woman who reigned in her own right. This was truly unprecedented. But Irene was vulnerable. She had effectively cut off the branch she was sitting on. With Constantine dead, this meant there was nobody to continue the Isaurian Dynasty. It wasn't obvious who would succeed her, so this opened the door for opportunistic usurpers, eager for their chance to seize the throne. The sons of Constantine V, Irene's brothers-in-law, were still alive. If you recall, they had already tried to coup the legitimate regime 3 times. For this, they had been whipped, ordained, and blinded or mutilated. But in the early years of Irene's sole rule, they tried twice more. As it turns out, the 5th time is not the charm. Those who weren't already blinded were blinded, and all were exiled to Athens. In the late 790s, Arab raids into Asia Minor became more aggressive, and Irene was forced to pay more tribute to the caliph. This further damaged Irene's legitimacy, and she embarked on a desperate campaign to shore up support. She organized a grand procession on Pascha of 799. On another occasion, she rode through the city on a golden chariot and tossed coins to the crowd. She also reduced taxes. Significantly, she also brought Saints Theodore and Plato back from exile. As Irene struggled to assert herself in Constantinople, Roman prestige was being challenged in the West. On Christmas Day in 800, Charlemagne was crowned as Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. This monumental event represents the consummation of the growing relationship between the Papacy and the Franks, which we've seen mature and develop over the course of the 8th century. Speaking of the significance of the coronation, Father John Strickland says, "Whatever the cause of the crowning at St. Peter's, the effect was tremendous. For Christians, there could only be one church, and for 4 centuries there had been only one empire. Roman had come to mean Christian, and even though there were states and lands beyond the limits of Christian Romanitas, everyone agreed that membership in Christendom necessarily entailed some level of participation in the life and fortunes of the Roman Empire. Even at the edge of the world in distant Ireland, Celtic Christians had prayed regularly for the Empire of the Romans, that is, for Byzantium. From Constantine to Justinian in the east, and from Augustine to Gregory the Great in the west, no one had ever thought that there could be anything but a single Christian empire. In a single act, Pope Leo's coronation of Charlemagne changed all of that. Christendom still may have possessed only one church, but now there were 2 Roman empires to claim her. The coronation of Charlemagne marks the beginning of the Carolingian Empire, the precursor to the Holy Roman Empire. As Father John pointed out, this was a direct challenge to the identity of the Romans in Constantinople. Prior to 800, almost everybody understood that the emperor in Constantinople was the Roman emperor. But from here on out, that title was contested, with neither side explicitly recognizing the other as Roman. As I've argued, this political schism foreshadows the later ecclesiastical schism. Western Christians insultingly described the Byzantine emperor as the Emperor of the Greeks, or the Emperor of Constantinople. In response, the Byzantines variously referred to the Holy Roman Emperor as the Emperor or King of the Franks, or the King of Germany. If there's enough interest, I'll make a dedicated video about this topic, but if you want to briefly know my opinion, it probably won't surprise anyone that I side with Constantinople. It's a complicated subject, and I can understand why some of our Roman Catholic friends think differently, even though I disagree with them. Anyways, as insulting as this was to the Romans of Constantinople, Irene attempted to foster good relations with the Franks. In fact, Irene and Charlemagne almost married. If this marriage had gone through, then presumably their domains would have been fused. It goes without saying that this may have had massive implications for the subsequent history of Europe, but for whatever reason the marriage never materialized. It was irrelevant anyways because Irene's days were numbered. It seems that she had lost credibility with the people of Constantinople because when the coup came there was no popular resistance. Late at night on October 31st, 802, Irene was at another palace in the city when several high-ranking officials went to the Great Palace. There they proclaimed a new emperor named Nikephoros and sent some soldiers to arrest Irene. She was exiled to a monastery on the island of Principos in the Sea of Mamre. A year later, Nikephoros exiled her to Lesbos, where she died in 803. Thus ended the Isaurian Dynasty. How should we rank Irene? She was undeniably intelligent and ambitious. From an administrative point of view, she had some success. For example, she managed to reassert Roman authority in Greece. On the other hand, Irene's reign also saw some significant military defeats. From a strictly administrative point of view, she was mediocre, neither good or bad. But at the end of the day, all of that is secondary. The more interesting question is regarding her status in the church. There are some who regard Irene as a saint, but is she really a canonized saint of the church? To be completely honest, I don't know. I did some pretty extensive research on this question, and there seems to be evidence to support both conclusions. I'll show you what I found, and you can make your own judgment. Obviously, the elephant in the room is the way Irene treated her son Constantine. This seems absolutely cold-hearted and inexcusable. At first glance, Irene comes across as a terrible mother, a Machiavellian empress who blinded her own son, effectively murdering him in order to grasp power for herself. There's no question that Irene's treatment of her son was atrocious, but I don't think this necessarily precludes her from being a saint. If the prerequisite for sainthood was perfection, then paradise would be empty, and there certainly wouldn't be any hope for a wretch like me. Speaking about St. Constantine, who we should remember committed a similar sin, Archimandrite Meletios reminds us there isn't a saint who hasn't wept and hasn't repented of sins. So, did Irene repent? There is some evidence that she repented, but in my opinion, it's not conclusive. Her last words as empress were noble, humbly accepting her overthrow as God's will because of her sins. This could be seen as an indication of repentance, but it seems like this is the only evidence, so it's somewhat weak by itself. There is a hagiography that was written about Irene, but it was lost to history and only rediscovered many years later. If you're interested in this, Warren Treadgold wrote a fascinating article about Irene's lost hagiography, and I'll leave a link to it in the description below. As Treadgold points out, most of it is simply a one-for-one copy of the Chronographia of St. Theophanes, so it isn't particularly original in any way. Furthermore, the anonymous hagiographer doesn't appear to make any effort to show that Irene repented, which is a strange omission if there was more evidence of her repentance. On one hand, I can't find Irene's name in most of the sources that I normally check to look up saints. Orthodox Wiki calls it a misconception that Irene of Athens is considered a saint in the Orthodox Church, and suggests that this confusion comes from the Bollandists. Robert Spencer concurs, saying that Empress Irene is remembered with great respect among Orthodox Christians, but her name does not appear in the listings of the saints. On the other hand, I was able to find her in a couple of places. Irene is listed in the prologue on August 7th, so I think that should count for something. Additionally, she is also listed in the book Pious Kings and Right-Believing Queens by Proto-Presbyter James Thornton. That book is a great resource for Orthodox royal saints, and I highly recommend it. But at the same time, I don't trust it with complete confidence, because it also includes some highly dubious individuals, such as Constantine XI. Finally, it's alleged that St. Theodore the Studite had tremendous praise for Irene, but unfortunately I was unable to track down the primary source where he says that. Personally, I have a ton of respect for Irene when it comes to her religious policy. Of course, her greatest legacy is the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Some critics might try to diminish this accomplishment, arguing that it wasn't such a big deal because, after all, iconoclasm had a rebirth less than 3 decades later. I think that's unfair. Yes, iconoclasm returned, but Irene's council laid the groundwork for the eventual destruction of that heresy. Nevertheless, it seems like her status is controversial. In my view, Irene is very similar to Justinian II. Both were pious Orthodox sovereigns who called important councils. Both exhibited imperfect personal lives, and both have a murky canonization status. Because of this uncertainty, I'll refrain from putting Irene in the S tier. Regarding Irene, I'll reiterate what I said about Justinian. Maybe she is a saint. I just can't say with confidence that she's a canonized saint. Since she ended the first phase of iconoclasm, I'll put her in the B tier with Justinian II. That concludes my video on the Roman emperors of the 20 Years Anarchy and the Isaurian Dynasty. Thanks for watching. What do you think about these emperors? Do you agree or disagree with my rankings? And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. With that, I'll see you guys next time.